Should you centralize or decentralize data analytics? 4 trends that you can't afford to miss, what industry leaders teach us about the future of data, as well as a great book recommendation for you this week. Welcome to the top 5 data, AI, and analytics post of the week. It's data-driven CarCast, the weekend update where I review, highlight, and recap for you what's hot and what's not in the world of data. And if you like this, make sure to subscribe, comment, like, share, use, and abuse this content. As always, you know that I'm going to put a link down below in comments taking you to a blog where I have all the resources, references, and links that I'm going to refer to here in this blog, as well as a nice slide deck for you that you can use to share with your friends and colleagues. By the way, some of you have reached out to me and asked if Bernard Moore and I are planning on doing a monthly Data, AI, and Analytics LinkedIn Live this month after last week's Clubhouse session. And the answer to that is yes. In fact, if you head over to my blog and scroll down all the way to the bottom, you'll find a simple link that you can click on in order to add the session to your calendar easily. Our next session is going to be Friday, 8 a.m. Pacific time, 11 a.m. Eastern time, 4 p.m. UK time. Tens of thousands of you have joined us already for these live sessions. They're fun. We love your questions. We prepare some, and then we also take live questions from people participating. So I hope that you can join us this coming Friday. Now, in my intro, I talked about this question. Should you use centralized or decentralized data analytics? This is a question that's been going on for many, many years. Every CIO and chief data officer I talked to asked about this organizational challenge. I remember almost 10 years ago now talking to Patrick Kern, who was director of analytics at Procter & Gamble. Back then, he was explaining to me that he had taken 300 embedded data analysts that technically report into IT but work for the business, and that allowed them to reduce 70% of the friction involved in acting on information. So the answer to your question here, at least according to Tom Davenport and Randy Bean in the latest piece of Forbes this past week, is both. And the recommendation is you should centralize data and decentralize analytics. And the rationale, if you will, the principles that Tom and Randy use in their piece is that the what and the why of analytics is really the responsibility of the business, and the how is a central data function because governance, security, and so forth, and the ability to scale the storage and the security of the data. There's a lot in that piece. For instance, consideration on what do you do about producers and consumers of data, the importance of data and analytics education. Often we talked about literacy, but here I talk about education. The power of machine learning and AI. Like I said, ton of best practices that will help you harness the power of data and drive value from it. Speaking of which, Tom Davenport, and you know him, he's a very well-known author in this world of data analytics. He's also a very prolific writer. In fact, this week, he also authored a Harvard Business Review piece with my friend and book co-author Joey Fitz about how new generations of analytics applications are emerging and incorporate automation and contextual intelligence to drive more value out of data. Congratulations to Joey and Tom for this great piece. Add it to your reading list. It will help you kick off your week as you look at ways to make better decisions. Great piece in Harvard Business Review. Now, speaking of making better decisions, I want to point you to a podcast I listened to this past week from McKinsey on better decision making, particularly when it comes to what's called decision meetings. So McKinsey research found that executives on average spend about 40% of their time making decisions, and 60% say that the time spent making decisions is actually poorly used. So it's a very painful process, doesn't have a great outcome. And so in this podcast, and there's also a transcript of it if you don't have time to listen to podcasts, they talk about the solution. And what's the solution? One is clarify the decision-making process. It's a pretty obvious one. You got principles like RACI and ORPI. When I was at Microsoft, ORPI is an acronym, stands for Owner, Approver, Reviewer, Participant, and Informed. Very similar to RACI. And then second is role definition, which is what I'm talking about here. In the McKinsey piece, they've identified 4 roles. One is the decision maker. These are the people actually, they have to make the decision, they have a vote, and they need to jointly align, and if they can't align, they need to figure out a path to escalate or resolve. Then there are the advisors, and those, they have a critical voice, they're affected by the decision, they don't always have a vote. And so they have a voice, but they might not have a vote. Then there's the recommenders. These are people that prepare the decision-making process. They might prepare solutions, not directly affected by the decision, but they're here to make the decision process a little smoother. And then finally, the fourth role, which is extremely important, is this idea of execution partners. These are the people in the room because their job is implementing and executing on the decision. It turns out when you look at McKinsey's research, they say that you can cut out about 30% of your meetings by delegating and organizing these decision meetings a lot better. And on average, 40% of the people involved in decision meetings today actually contribute very little value. And so this connects to this concept I've talked about in the past, idea meritocracy, which is, if you're looking to read more about that, Ray Dalio's book on principles is a great way of saying, hey, look, not everybody has to have a vote. Of course, you want to take as many voices as possible, but you want to make sure that you make decisions based on the votes that are more involved and more capable of influencing the decision. So there's lots of nuggets in the podcast, and if you don't have the time to listen to the podcast or even read the transcript, I want to actually quote them for you. Aaron, one of the McKinsey partners here, says that deciding to do something is actually quite different from acting on it. So decisions that are fast is great, but executing, moving on them fast is as important. He also says that more than 6 decision makers with a vote starts to become a problem. And this reminds me of Amazon's 2 pizza rule. I've read about this in this great book by John Rossman. I think John actually was a Microsoft employee and an Amazon employee. This is a great book to read on decision making, and Amazon's got this great principle of like, you got teams that are bigger than 2 pizzas. Well, maybe you got to ask yourself about the effectiveness of action and decision making in that team. Great read. Going back to McKinsey podcast, research showed that the number one predictor of fast and high quality decisions for big bet is actually the quality of the debate. So encouraging the debate is an important one. And then finally, one last nugget from this podcast. There's a counterintuitive insight here is that to move faster, you need to involve more people. Anyway, take a listen to this podcast. Read the transcript if you don't have time. This is a great way to start your week. There's a lot more in the blog. I talked in the intro about trends. You'll find all the references there on trends for 2021 for data management, as well as trends for the future 10 years out. You also find a link to my first official Google blog where I talk about great customer examples from Vodafone and Unity and PwC. And of course, I talk in my blog about my customer of the week, Juan, the Rackspace Chief Data Officer. So thank you again so much for the continued engagement every week where I do these quick recordings and you guys come back to me with great suggestions. I want to thank you for doing that. I love your comments, your direct messages. And so thank you for doing that. Stay engaged, be data-driven, have a great week, and I will see you next week.